Well, thank you very much indeed, and a very good morning to what is this special GZERO media presentation from the 2025 World Economic Forum here in Davos in Switzerland. I am Becky Anderson, host of Connect the World with Becky Anderson and managing editor in Abu Dhabi for the Gulf for CNN. And today we are discussing what may be the most transformative technological force of our time, and that is artificial intelligence and its potential to drive unparalleled economic growth. The International Data Corporation estimates that AI could add up to 20 trillion to GDP growth by 2030. That is monumental. And it feels particularly timely this morning, as just a couple of hours ago, of course, the new US President Donald Trump unveiled what he is calling the largest AI infrastructure project in history. The $500 billion or $500 billion joint venture, Stargate, brings together OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank to build what is a vast network of data centers across the country. Trump has promised that this will not only supercharge AI development, but it will create as many as, if not more, than 100,000 American jobs almost immediately, he says. The big challenge, of course, as we look to where this AI era is set, is ensuring that the benefits are shared equally. This is inclusive and that nobody in the world is left behind. We have a star panel for you today to tackle some of these key angles. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is Director General, of course, of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Brad Smith is the Vice Chair and President of Microsoft. He is our co-host today. Nadia Calviño is President of the European Investment Bank. Peng Xiao is the CEO of G42, which is an Abu Dhabi-based AI company focused on AI development across a myriad of sectors. And Ian Bremmer is the President and founder of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. I'd like you to put your hands together and welcome them all to the stage. Brad, let's start with you. A year ago, the conversation around AI was focused very squarely on the fear factor. It'll take away jobs, AI will impact elections, it poses a threat if ungoverned. These were conversations which were at the top of everybody's discussions here in Davos. And since then, a year on, the narrative has evolved significantly. None of this is unfamiliar to you. You have been sort of behind the scenes, the engine of where this AI era is set to a degree. Where is AI in 2025? Let's start there.
Well, I think the hype cycle is subsiding and people are getting to work. A year ago, it was this notion that AI is going to save the world. No, AI is going to destroy humanity. The world hasn't been saved and humanity hasn't been destroyed. I do think that we recognize that AI is sort of the new electricity. It's a general purpose technology that can spread across the economy. We did a good job, I think, collectively as governments and civil society and companies in protecting elections from deep fakes throughout 2024. And I think now we're more focused on all the real work that needs to get done and rolling up our sleeves and getting at it and recognizing this isn't going to be something that lasts months. It'll actually be years and decades that will define much of this century.
And how has the new US president got his arms so effectively around AI?
Well, no US president, no head of state has one's arms around everything on day 3. And that's all this is. This is day 3 of a new administration. I think the interesting thing about Donald Trump is this is not his first time as president of the United States. And what's interesting is the first White House executive order on AI was actually issued by Donald Trump. It was in February of 2019, and he fundamentally put, I think, 3 big stakes in the ground in that executive order. He said he wanted the U.S. to invest in science and in technology, including research. He said that he wanted to skill the workforce, and he said he wanted to open markets around the world for American AI. And I think as he comes back into office, he has an opportunity to bring even more energy to that, and you're seeing that in some of the early statements he's making.
Peng, Brad describing AI as impactful as electricity. Perhaps we could add in there computer chips and software. How is that manifesting itself right now? And Brad alluded to the different sectors that AI is having an impactful influence on. How is that manifesting itself across sectors like healthcare, like science, for example, like finance? Can you just explain?
I think we've entered now a new phase of AI from the promise to purpose. Take healthcare, for example. In Abu Dhabi, some of you may know, we're running the world's largest population genomics program. Each long-read sequence of human DNA is 6 billion data points, 6 billion. It's actually like a book. It's a biology language. So we are right now using AI in the UAE to actually understand human biology, applying large language models to understand our health. It's a highly impactful research and commercial initiative because we are actually leveraging AI to build a new platform for researchers and healthcare service providers. That is one example where AI is impacting our society. Of course, investment, security, so many areas, AI now is beginning to serve its purpose.
Director General, let me just bring you in here and get your sense of where we are at, because you've been quite vocal and quite upbeat, and I think perhaps to some surprisingly so, about the possibilities that AI presents for global trade. So just lay the table for us, if you will. From your perspective, how do we ensure that upside can benefit more regions and more nations?
Well, thank you. I hope I haven't been too upbeat, because there are also downside risks to AI, as we all know. But we just did a report at the WTO called Trading with Intelligence. And the work that we've done shows that there are potential very significant upsides to AI in trade. And this is fascinating. I mean, AI will change the nature of some of the products traded, making them into new products. AI has potential to do one thing, which is very important, to get developing countries more integrated into global markets, and that is reduce trade costs. Through the supply chain, we found significant impact. And you have companies like DP World, the private sector is using AI, and we are seeing that impact on supply chain management and the reduction of costs. So we're quite excited about that. So through those mechanisms, we've seen that if we can really have an implementation and adoption of AI across the board in both high-income and low-income countries, we've done simulations that show that world trade could increase by about 14% by 2040. This is significant. However, if we cannot get this uniform adoption, then the increase drops substantially. It halves, actually, which means that we must work hard to ensure that the global south becomes part of this access to AI and adoption. And that's very challenging, because we know that in Africa, for example, 38% of the people have access to the internet, compared to maybe 68% worldwide and even 90 or so in rich countries. So how do we do this? How do we avoid creating another AI divide that will penalize the world, not just the developing countries? That is the key. And I think it begins with bridging that digital divide, having investment in electricity access, because you can't do this without fundamentals of access to electricity and access to the internet. Those are two key things that we need to think about.
Thank you. And I want to come back to that point, because I think it's important perhaps that we discuss as a case study here, the G42 Microsoft plans for $1 billion investment in Kenya. In Kenya, I think a UNDP report recently suggested that only 5% of AI talent has access to compute at the moment. So I think the case study that you guys are involved in is important to discuss here. Before we do that, let me just bring you in, Nadia, if I can. Investment in new technologies is key. There's no doubt about that. How is Europe approaching AI from an investment perspective? And can you foster not just adoption, but also innovation here?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. As Brad knows, I'm passionate about this subject, not as president of the European Investment Bank, not only as president of the European Investment Bank, but as ex-vice president of the Spanish government and ex-minister for the digital transformation of the country. And I have been reflecting a lot about these in the last years. And I think I'd just like to make three comments. First, yes, investment is necessary, and yes, as a European Investment Bank, we are investing not only in the take-up of the technology, but as Brad was referring to, on how to deploy it throughout the economy in a manner which brings more prosperity, more productivity in Europe and beyond. And Europe is an innovation powerhouse, a research powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse, a trade powerhouse, by the way. And so I do think that there's a very strong basis that would allow us to make the most of this technology. But the second remark is that trust is the key to unlock the full potential of AI for businesses and citizens. Like every human technology, it can be used for good and for evil. And citizens and businesses need to be sure that there are no biases, that there is inclusiveness, also when it comes to how these algorithms are designed, how they are run. And it is a global endeavor, and that's my third and final point. And so I think it is very important that we work together. It's very good that, I don't know if it's very good, but anyway, it's very relevant that there is a national strategy coming out from different jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, we do have a responsibility vis-a-vis future generations when it comes to energy use, the impact of algorithms on our democracies, and how AI is actually making a better world. So I would say, transparency, responsibility, accountability, trust, at the end of the day, is one of the key words we need to very much.
And the EU early out of the gate with the EU Act, AI Act, we are now in an era, certainly from the US standpoint, where we have a US president who is likely to be much more hands-off with regard regulation. So I want to get your perspective on where the EU is at as far as competitiveness is concerned, when it is perceived to be perhaps more highly regulated in this arena than other places going forward, and how that might impact Europe's success going forward. Before we do that, Ian, let me bring you in here for your first sort of lay the table comments, as it were. Your top risks list for 2025 had AI unbound at number 8. How do you see that regulatory environment shifting in the coming months, and what risks could that create?
Well, we're starting upbeat here, and I don't mind that at all, in the sense that there is enormous effort by every actor that's touching AI right now, try to ensure competitiveness, try to ensure productivity, try to take advantage of these tools and set them to work. Everyone agrees with that. The UK, I thought, was most interesting in headlines because they put their initial flag in saying AI Safety Summit. This year they've rebranded. It's the AI Action Summit. That tells you a lot about where the priorities are, right? Now, I completely agree with Brad. We're 3 days into Trump, so how can you possibly read what he's going to do? On the other hand, it doesn't take him long to put a tweet out, right? So I think that there are two things we've seen so far, and one is that the United States is absolutely leaning in to the sharp end of the spear, right, of industrial policy for the Americans globally, which is AI and related constellation of technologies that make that happen, right? Trump is going to be committed to that. He's got some of the world's best technologists around him supporting him, both to make sure that they are appointing people that are capable and also to drive capital. Great. What's the other thing he's done in the first 3 days? He has pulled out of global architecture. the Paris Accord, the World Health Organization. What is a world going to look like when the country that is doing the most to try to ensure that it is driving that innovation is also at the same time withdrawing from global responsibilities and architecture that it created, which we've never seen before? And the answer is that's going to make it harder to accomplish many of the things that Ngozi wants to see, right? Which is that, and by the way, this is not about reparations for damage that's done. This should be easy. This isn't like, oh, you've destroyed the environment, so now you have to pay us for all the damage you've done. This isn't zero sum, it's positive sum. This is about opening markets. This is about improving human capital. This is about industrial innovation. These are things that we should want for Africa, things we should want for lower developed countries. And I'm excited about that, but it is absolutely unclear to me that that is a priority of the Trump administration.
Brad.
Yes? I think
Healthy tension, healthy tension.
I would say two things. Well, look, we need AI to move around the world. I actually think that the story of electricity is in part the single greatest technology tragedy in the history of the world, because 150 years after it was first invented, we still have 700 million people who don't have it. And so you need this technology to move around the world. And it cannot move around the world unless there is some level of regulatory consistency. And I do think right now, where there have been, call it longer regulations, well, I'll even omit the word heavy. The EUA Act, it's a long document. Some of the Biden administration executive orders, they're long documents. And you hear people saying, maybe we can make this simpler. And I think that is a good thing. And at the same time, I think we do need engagement. I remember in 1998 when a Republican member of Congress came to visit me at Microsoft's headquarters in Redmond, Washington. And she said, I just want you to know, because she was the fourth most senior Republican member of Congress, and they had the majority. She said, I just want you to know that as long as I am in Congress, the Congress will never pass a federal privacy law. And I said, I know you think that is helpful, but all you're really doing is rendering the United States government irrelevant in terms of international influence. What will happen is Brussels will move ahead. Sacramento will move ahead. That history played out. A quarter of a century later, we can look around the world and we can see that there's 120 countries that have privacy laws, but not the United States. And you can look at the United States itself and see that every tech company, period, basically implements European privacy law and California privacy law. We need a level of pragmatic engagement in order for American technology to be accessible.
So what do you make then of Trump's approach to AI governance? He has rescinded or rolled back or cancelled, for example, Joe Biden's AI Safety Act. You're suggesting that in the past, America was slow out of the gate and had to adopt other countries or blocs' approaches. But you also suggest that a lot of what was left by the Biden administration, these long, sort of dense sort of documents. I mean, and I understand, and many will, that simplification is important, but watering down to the degree that there is no safety doesn't put America in a kind of first out of the gate position, does it?
Well, if there was an executive order that was, I think, 110 pages or so long, and now there's nothing, there's a lot of room in between 0 and 110. And it's day 3. So I think people will come in, they're already learning quickly. And I actually think even when I come to Europe, when I go to Berlin or Paris or Madrid or elsewhere, I hear people in government, and I especially hear the startup community say, I hope people are pragmatic as they implement these things. If you want investment, if you want innovation, and if you want adoption, we need to find some middle ground that will work.
Let's have a push this on. It seems, Peng, let's
Everybody else wants to, anybody want to jump in on this?
Yeah. No, Ngozi, go on. Yeah, well, please do.
Yeah, I want to jump in.
Yeah.
I want to say, look, the private sector is coming up with these heavy investments. Don't they also bear some responsibility in terms of trying to explain, to the policymakers and the leaders that, look, you cannot really succeed in this as good for the world unless you have some amount of global cooperation. And it's incumbent on them. They're putting up the money. They have $1 trillion and the investment in data centers all around the world. And they know this, Brad. So I'm also asking the private sector, what is your accountability and responsibility to explain this? I'm very glad everyone is still a member of the International Telecommunications Union. Doreen is there, sitting in front, and that's one multilateral organization to enable us talk to each other. And they've actually been working hard on how do we manage this AI governance and how can we set about it. So if we stay within that, can the private sector encourage our leaders that there are some multilateral approaches to this? So that's my challenge to you.
Oh, absolutely, and I want to make two remarks. First of all, I think the UN, and I know, there may be a lot of doubts as to, well, can the UN actually be relevant? Well, the UN did produce a very good report last year on this, on the international, you were there. We know some people, we contributed a lot. I think because this is a global challenge, we should have global frameworks. And actually, it is a very good report that sets out the challenges, but also has an approach that would allow this technological development to continue and to succeed in a manner which provides trust throughout the world and includes all parts of the world. So I think there we have a good roadmap or a good blueprint for what could be this global governance. But secondly, in Europe, we were very careful and very mindful not to stifle innovation and technological development, but to focus not on the technology, but on the use of the technology, and to differentiate very well what a startup and a small innovative company is, then a massive company that can really have an influence, and what sort of uses should be banned altogether, and what uses should just be watched. Being very aware that no public authority will ever be able to get into the algorithms and outbeat the actual producing private company in this area. We have to be very humble as public responsible people. So I very much agree with Ngozi, and I think that's your approach also, Brad, which is there's a shared responsibility as a public responsible person, be it in the private sector or in the public sector, to work together and to make sure that what we leave for future generations is an improvement in terms of the prosperity, the well-being, the security around the world.
President Trump seems to lead a generation or a group of unsubscribers. Somebody described this to me as this the other day. We've been for 70 years subscribing to multilateral agreements, organizations that will work for the benefit of sort of the global good. And it does feel now that we are, moving down a route on a journey of unsubscribing. And so, to Ngozi's point, you are eager to see some sort of global agreements here, but you have a US president who does not seem to subscribe to the sort of global way of doing things. So I just wonder, what your perspective is on that, and what sort of, realistically where you see this US administration going when it comes to sort of a global framework. And let me just ask, to this point, what is the private sector's responsibility, both Peng and Brad?
From private sector point of view and the technology practitioner's point of view, I think we should separate rhetorics from the real substance of the action here. One thing I actually do applaud what Trump is doing right now is to launch a global infrastructure build-out initiative. Mm-hmm. We've been talking a lot about this. This example you give, Brad, and you really opened my eyes on this. In a big part of Africa today, still, there's no electricity. The lack of electricity around the world actually gave birth to the situation we call Global South. We cannot afford for intelligence not to be equally distributed. To do that, we must begin to build global infrastructure in parallel to all the policy discussions. Today, globally, we have about 60 gigawatt of data center. What was announced yesterday was to build 10 more gigawatt in US alone. And if our forecast as technology professionals is actually correct, we probably need double, triple amount of global data center infrastructure. I'm glad to see a government actually now pushing, leading this investment, and private sector is responding to it. But yes, I fully agree. This got to be done in a way that is equitable, systematic, and in coordination with other regions. But overall, I'm actually very optimistic. We are on the right path to build the next what I call intelligence grid, in addition to this electricity grid.
Okay. So first of all, when you mentioned unsubscribers, I thought you were talking about the Washington Post. Because clearly he has been leading a lot of that. But it is absolutely true that the Americans are increasingly saying that a lot of the architecture, a lot of the values, a lot of the standards that have been promoted by the US and promoted by a lot of people attending the World Economic Forum don't work for us. So what do you do in response to that? And there are three things you do. You either take your existing institutions and reform them so that they work more effectively for you. You build new institutions or architecture, or you go to war. Those are your options, right? And all three are happening. And I agree completely with Peng. I think that I'm excited about new infrastructure being built. I look at this, diffusion efforts on AI and semiconductors, which Biden put out and which I don't think Trump is going to rip up or rescind. He's got 120 days. I think that they will probably, expand Tier 1 so it includes like maybe all of NATO or at least more countries that are in it right now, things like that. That would be smart. But, it is a plan that will help, in addition to the announcements that we've seen made, in addition to work together with the private sector, that will help build out a national emergency on energy. It's not about oil. It's not about gas. It's actually about smart electricity. And who would have thought that 5 years ago, right? Those are intelligent things. But what are we doing about avoiding the latter piece, the going to war piece? It took the Americans and Chinese about 18 months just to agree that we shouldn't have AI in nuclear launch decision-making, which I could have agreed with you on this in about 5 seconds, okay? That shouldn't have taken 18 months. That should have been a no-brainer, but it didn't happen because there is zero trust between the Americans and Chinese. There had been zero military-to-military open channels. Remember that balloon? Wasn't AI, it was just a balloon, right? But the Americans used their hotline to call the Chinese. Chinese didn't answer the phone. That's a problem, right? So what are we going to do as we build this infrastructure with Tier 1 and some Tier 2 and no Tier 3 countries, right? What are we going to do to ensure that the Americans and Chinese do not engage in an AI arms race? Because the last time we did that, it resulted in 1962. And then, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was, we probably need to have some arms control agreements. Can we not wait for that, right, this time around? Because I don't see that being prioritized. I absolutely don't.
They can start by making a deal on TikTok.
That would. I don't know who you know at TikTok, but we could. That's certainly.
But can I come in on that, because I think you've touched upon it. You've made a very interesting comparison with electricity, and I mean, after the Second World War, nuclear energy was the issue. Well, there was an agreement at global level about nuclear energy, and that's what has allowed nuclear energy to become a force for good throughout the decades, so that we can have energy generation. Now, I think we do absolutely need a similar agreement at global level right now when we're talking about AI. So I think we're all aligned. But the second reflection I have is that the world order after the Second World War has served very well Europe. As a European, I can only say peace, security, stability, globalization, trade, prosperity, okay? But it has served exceedingly well the US. So it's a bit difficult to understand how this multilateral order would not continue to be the best way forward, adjusted, upgraded with a better representation of the different countries around the world, responding to today's challenges. But why would you throw away the baby with the bathwater when you're discussing something as relevant, as the world order that has served so well the US?
So let me jump in, I think, on the back of Ian's very good comments and Nadia's. As a follow-up, I do agree that we need to admit that the multilateral institutions need reform, that there are many aspects that are not fit for 21st century purposes. And at the WTO, some of our agreements clearly need to be updated. I think if we're very honest about saying that the three options you give, we certainly don't want a third world war, okay? We don't even want a third world war on tariffs, by the way, because we've been there, done that before in 1930s, and it didn't work. So we don't want that, and we know that there's skepticism about existing multilateral institutions. Yet it is so exceedingly clear that the problems we have today are wicked problems, in the sense that they cannot be solved by any one nation alone. So even if you want to opt out, at the end of the day, you'll come back to it and see, I really need the others. But multilateral organizations need to be honest in saying, and they have been accepting, and we should be vocal, that we need to reform and update. And that can bring back some of the trust, some of the confidence in the system, and enable us to move forward and say, what type of global governance do we need for AI? Because it is dangerous. I'm coming from a very optimistic or sort of cautious optimism on its use, because I can see it, for developing countries, it can leapfrog them in various aspects. In agriculture, you can use it to do more precision farming that can help farmers deliver greater productivity. In healthcare, it can help with diagnostics where people don't have access to medical care. And in education, the same. So all the areas where countries in the global south need to improve. AI can make a material, but we need global governance. So let's come forward. Maybe if we're doing that, it will be easier for those who don't trust so much to begin to see that, look, we cannot do it alone. That's my thesis.
Brad.
I think that's a really good point, and I think the nuclear analogy is interesting in the following way. In 1953, Dwight Eisenhower was president of the United States, and he went to the UN General Assembly, and he gave a very famous speech. He called for the use of atoms for peace. And out of that speech, there were basically two initiatives. One was the creation of a global institution, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the other was a bilateral U.S. policy initiative to create what became known as Section 123 agreements, bilateral agreements that were put in place between the United States and more than 40 countries so that U.S. nuclear power technology could go to other countries with assurances that they would be secure, they wouldn't be diverted to other countries, and the material wouldn't be used to create nuclear weapons. Now we come to AI. Literally in the 12 months since we were here a year ago, that is the inspiration we took. Microsoft and G42 had to negotiate an agreement for our technology to come together to build out and have G42 build out data centers in the UAE and around the world. So we first created an agreement between ourselves. We called it an Intergovernmental Assurance Agreement, basically constructed the same way to ensure that the AI technology and the GPUs would be secure, they wouldn't be diverted for improper uses. Out of that framework, the US then needed to create an export licensing regime. The litmus test, the so-called guinea pig or experiment, was an export license that Microsoft had to secure last year to export GPUs to the UAE. So the US government, on an interagency basis, basically took the concepts that we had developed and spent a lot of time. It was a laborious and slow process, but fashioned an export license with conditions that, again, underscored these same things. And then this last administration, in its last week, concluded with this long rule about so-called AI diffusion, call it really AI export controls, that it tries to apply this on a global basis. And I completely agree with Ian. There's an opportunity to look at it, to simplify it. But when you look through all the details, what you see is the emergence of a new regime to export AI around the world as nuclear power was exported around the world. And I think that is now moving forward, and that's a good thing.
That is a regime to export AI, and certainly American AI, around the world to friends and allies, of course. And the US government to date is focused on protecting sensitive AI components through export controls. And you're right to explain, and I think it's important for the audience to hear this, that the G42 Microsoft deal was very much a litmus test. I mean, it has provided a real precedent for work going forward. You identified, Brad, the promotion of American AI exports as a key priority. Can you just further explain the approach as you see it, and within the context of what Ian has said, in that he sees President Trump's return to office, within the context of tech as unleashing a real sort of US-China breakdown?
Yeah, I would say there's two things to think about. First, look, from our perspective, obviously we have a business that is aimed at bringing AI to the world here being the United States, Europe, NATO, American allies, American friends, fundamentally most of the world. And it's important to do that. If you look at the race that took place between the United States and Europe together against China, really on, say, telecommunications equipment, what became 5G, Europe and the United States lost that race, in my view, in many ways, because China combined impressive technological innovation by Huawei with government subsidies and basically paid countries to adopt their technology. And it's impossible, really, to compete with zero when zero becomes the price you're competing against. So the good news this time is, unlike for telecommunications equipment, you do have the private sector, and you have private equity and private capital all wanting to invest, so that European governments, the US government, those subsidies are not needed. But I think, and this goes to the issues around world trade and the like, we still need help, in my view, from governments as they come together. Peng and I have spent a lot of time together, our teams have spent a lot of time together on this initiative in Kenya. There's 50 million people in Kenya. It's hard to make a data center economically viable if it can only serve 50 million people. Right. But if you add in the people of Ethiopia and Tanzania and Uganda and Rwanda,
Eastern Africa as a whole,
all of East Africa,
500 million people.
Now you have a market that in private capital can serve. And so the real opportunity, I think, from a, call it, trade law perspective, is to have those countries come together and create a data zone, much like countries create free trade zones, so that they can all use a data center in Kenya. So those other governments will have confidence that their sovereignty, their privacy and security for their data will be protected when it is in Kenya. And so, and then I think you have this global architecture that makes room for these things. That's how you avoid a repetition of, say, the technology tragedy that unfolded with electricity.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense to me. And I can see an environment where, I mean, if the United States is successful, and the Kenya example is such an important one because, let's face it, the United States has seen Africa as mostly an afterthought. It's been either, military presence and counterterrorism, or it's been international aid. And that's not a sustainable way to develop a relationship that works for any of the African countries, right? And we've seen that play out. This is a very different model. This is a model that actually treats Africans as partners and helps them to develop. I'm very excited about that. The way that we avoid tragedy is to recognize that this is a very different environment than the Cold War, right? So the Americans, if successful, can be dominant in all of these countries in creating this new data architecture in AI. That's very exciting. But you don't want that to be at the exclusion of these countries not being able to work with American adversaries, because that's going to create rogue behavior and isolationism. What's interesting is what I see happening is that the Americans are increasingly trying to dominate a lead in bits and on all this digital innovation, while the Chinese are increasingly becoming dominant in electrons, in energy. I mean, post-oil, and you talked about how excited you were to in the UAE to build the post-oil knowledge economy. Well, the Chinese are building the post-oil energy economy.
Well, China right now has 3 times more power capacity than the United States.
Absolutely.
And growing 5 times faster.
Yeah, and I mean, Trump is skeptical of nuclear, though maybe that's starting to change, but Xi Jinping isn't, right? And I mean, they've got the supply chain. And so a world where the Americans and Chinese are okay with the fact that countries are all going to align with the Americans, or vast majority, in a lot of these AI applications, but are all going to be tied to post-OPEC on China, that's a world that potentially is stable, but it is very challenging to get from here to there. And we have to with eyes open. We have to with a recognition that there's interdependencies. And I don't see Trump as a guy who governs thinking about interdependencies. So we're going to have to help them. So if you want to ask, what's the responsibility of the private sector? And there are many, that's many hours of discussions that we haven't gotten to. But one responsibility of the private sector, so dominant in this space, is to help ensure that the United States doesn't hurt itself with narrow, short-sighted unilateralism.
So 3 thoughts from my side on what you were saying, and the example in East Africa is very relevant, I think. But to start with, you keep talking about architecture, infrastructure, data infrastructure, but for these to lead to more productivity and more prosperity for the people, you need take-up and for it to be actually changing the way we produce, the industry. That's why I keep emphasizing the point that Europe has a very important role to play, and because you do have some important industries, and we're talking clean tech, we're talking health tech, that actually can play an important role in spreading these in a productive and positive manner throughout our economies. My second reflection has to do with you need data, you need computing ability, capacity, and you need talent. And so you need to, and I would add, and you need trust. So this matter of trust is absolutely essential for businesses and citizens to actually help and embrace, let's say, these new technologies, and for them to unleash their full potential. And I think it's this second part is extremely important. So just to say, being very blunt, an approach that says, well, now we want to colonize the world with our technologies and bring to you, I don't know how attractive this is as a proposition, for the other part of the deal, let's say it this way. And then my final third point is, thank you for mentioning energy. As I mentioned it in my introductory remarks, I think that green is apparently not so much the flavor of the day in some parts of the world. I can tell you, Europe is absolutely committed to tackling climate change and to developing this green economy and making the green transition a European success. And I think it will be key when we're talking about these technologies that have such a huge demand for energy supply. I know that you're working a lot on how to become energy efficient. The fact that you are, investing in the Middle East says a lot about the link about the two technologies. I think these two elements have to go together if we want, again, that future generations actually think, well, my elders, they did a good job, not they left me with an unlivable planet because of these technological deployments in an unresponsible way.
So, yeah, let's take on both of those, skilling and clean energy.
What I would say, I think, Nadia, you make a critical point. And at the broadest level, what I would say is, I think as an American company, or if you think about the United States government, there may be a certain level of security standards and safeguards the U.S. government wants to see for this technology around the world. But in every country where we do business, where G42 or other companies do business, we have to be a trusted local supplier of critical digital infrastructure. That means we have to invest in accordance with local needs and values. There are different parts of the world that are going to have different, not just philosophies, but policies around sources of electricity and energy. I think everywhere we invest and work, we have a critical role to play to help defend the cyber domain in that country. I think we have to play an indispensable role in providing the skilling infrastructure so that this technology can be put to work. And the fascinating thing to me about Europe is I will argue that there are some European countries that maybe have more to gain from AI than almost anywhere else. Because if you look at the European economy, it is built on fundamental domain expertise and world-leading industries, whether it's chemicals or pharmaceuticals or autos or machine tools and the like. But if you look at every one of those sectors, the key to their competitiveness a decade from now is the incorporation of AI. And when you look at countries like, say, a Germany or an Italy, where the population is not just getting older, but literally the working age population is shrinking, there is a massive need for an infusion of new sources of productivity. So we need to meet sort of the local requirements and not just say we're here to come from the country where we're organized.
And you say we as Microsoft, as the private sector, as opposed to we, the US government. I mean, you are talking about a responsibility there from the private sector as well.
Yeah, I would say as a company, this is what our business is built on. And it does come to that word, trust. We have to be trusted by the local government every place we do business.
If you allow me, Brett, I think I would say it's also the concept of PPP, private-public sector partnership, which we have, I think, perfected in the UAE, where commercial ventures are linked with the broader national agenda. I want to make one more comment, if you allow me, which is, again, as a practitioner, I want to say that the call to action right now is we need to move faster with like-minded allies from US to the Middle East, because AI is moving much faster than any regulator can possibly even imagine today. And if we don't build this global infrastructure to force transparency in how models are being deployed, they're being used, soon enough, there'll be many smaller players, non-governmental players, can access and even build their own very advanced models. That's where I think the real risk will be.
We've run out of time. This has been absolutely fascinating. I do hope that you've enjoyed it. There is an awful lot of food for thought there. Thank you very much indeed to my panelists and to you, the audience, for joining us early here today in Davos. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.